The pristine white marble courtyard of Langford Dynamics was blinding under the harsh afternoon sun, surrounded by towering walls of tinted glass that mirrored the cold, unyielding world of corporate defense contracts. Victoria Langford stood tall in her tailored navy blue suit, her eyes flashing with a sharp, calculated corporate fury as her voice cut through the humid air, publicly terminating the employment of the man standing before her. Grant Sullivan, wearing his faded gray maintenance uniform, held his scratched steel toolbox in one hand and a dented red thermos in the other, his face a mask of absolute, unblinking composure. Suddenly, the heavy iron security gates at the perimeter of the campus were violently forced aside, and a massive synchronized convoy of 10 sleek, matte black government SUVs swept into the central plaza, their tires screeching loudly against the polished stone as they formed a protective crescent around the lawn. A heavy ceramic coffee mug slipped from the hand of a trembling vice president standing on the glass balcony above, shattering into 1,000 white shards on the marble steps below. The sudden, sharp explosion of porcelain echoing like a gunshot through the sudden, paralyzed silence of the courtyard. To find out how a quiet maintenance supervisor could command the absolute deference of the nation's highest-ranking military officials, while his billionaire boss stood frozen in absolute shock, stay until the very end. So many of you watching have lived through moments where your hardest work was completely ignored by those in power. And if these stories of overlooked dedication speak to your heart, please take a moment to share this journey with us as we dive into the truth. It raises the deep and enduring question of whether a dedicated parent should silently endure corporate disrespect for the sake of protecting their child's peace, or if staying completely quiet only allows the greedy to walk over those who truly built the foundation. 11 months earlier, the sprawling campus of Langford Dynamics operated under a completely different kind of pressure, far removed from the dramatic confrontation that would later unfold on its front steps. The facility was a sprawling labyrinth of high-tech laboratories and heavy industrial testing bays, all dedicated to securing a $12 billion aerospace propulsion contract for the United States Department of Defense. At the center of this frantic world was Grant Sullivan, a quiet, composed single father who spent his days walking the long concrete corridors in his grease-stained uniform, carrying a standard-issue clipboard and a leather tool belt. To the casual observer and to the newly appointed executives who roamed the upper floors, Grant was just another low-status employee, a maintenance supervisor responsible for checking valves, replacing worn seals, and ensuring the HVAC systems didn't fail. Nobody in the current administration knew that beneath his quiet demeanor and simple lifestyle lay the mind of a legendary former lead aerospace engineer. Years earlier, Grant had been the chief architect of the company's most advanced propulsion concepts, but his life had been completely upended by a sudden, private tragedy when his wife passed away after a long illness. In his deep grief, and with a burning desire to protect his 8-year-old daughter, Harper, from the ruthless, soul-crushing demands of executive life, Grant made a conscious choice to step away from the spotlight. He allowed his name to be quietly erased from the official corporate credits, choosing instead the predictable, low-stakes routine of a maintenance worker, so he could leave the facility precisely at 5 o'clock every evening to be a fully present father. He never raised his voice, he never complained about his drastically reduced status, and he noticed microscopic mechanical details that the youngest, most highly credentialed engineers completely overlooked. Meanwhile, the upper floors of the glass tower were ruled by Victoria Langford, a brilliant, high-pressure billionaire CEO who had recently inherited the company following her father's sudden retirement. Victoria was under an immense amount of external pressure from a demanding board of directors and a strict military delegation that required flawless execution of the upcoming Phoenix Propulsion initiative. She was not an inherently malicious leader, but her formal training in elite business schools had taught her to trust high-priced data models polished presentations, and the word of her senior executives, rather than the insights of the blue-collar workers on the assembly floor. She moved through the corridors like a storm, demanding absolute perfection and interpreting any sign of hesitation or unorthodox methodology as a direct threat to the company's survival. Her primary source of information was Harrison Vance, the polished, charming senior vice president of engineering who always wore custom-tailored Italian suits and spoke in a flawless stream of corporate jargon. Harrison was a master of corporate maneuvering, but he harbored a dark secret that tied him directly to Grant's hidden past. A decade prior, Harrison had intercepted a series of foundational mathematical equations and engine schematics left behind in a shared database. Equations secretly authored by Grant before his withdrawal from the industry and claimed them entirely as his own, riding that stolen genius straight into the executive suite. Now, with the critical government audit looming closer, Harrison lived in a state of constant hidden panic, terrified that the actual physical limitations of the prototype would expose his lack of true technical knowledge. He viewed Grant's presence on the maintenance crew as a ticking time bomb, constantly looking for any excuse to undermine the quiet supervisor and remove him from the premises before anyone could connect the dots between the old schematics and the man holding the wrench. Grant observed Harrison's frantic corporate posturing with a detached, excellent understanding, choosing to remain quiet because his sole priority was maintaining the steady, unremarkable income required to provide a stable, peaceful home for young Harper. 8 months would pass before that hidden friction finally worked its way to the surface, transforming a routine diagnostic check into a corporate battlefield. The atmospheric testing bay of Hangar 4 was filled with the deafening, rhythmic hum of massive ventilation turbines, the air thick with the faint scent of aviation fuel and cold ozone. Inside the glass-fronted control room, Harrison Vance was surrounded by a dozen junior technicians, all staring anxiously at a wall of digital monitors that displayed a series of erratic, spiking data lines. The prototype of the Phoenix propulsion system was undergoing its final high-pressure static fire simulation, a critical test that would determine whether Langford Dynamics would receive the multi-billion-dollar government funding. Suddenly, a series of bright red warning lights began flashing across the main console, indicating a severe telemetry failure and a dangerous pressure imbalance in the primary cryogenic fuel delivery lines. Harrison, completely out of his depth and failing to understand the underlying thermodynamics of the system he claimed to have invented, began shouting frantic, contradictory orders, demanding that the technicians increase the automated valve pressure to force the fuel through the manifold. Down on the lower maintenance gantry, Grant Sullivan stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a specific external bypass valve that was vibrating with a rhythmic, microscopic chatter that only an expert eye would notice. He knew, based on the physics of the design he had authored years ago, that increasing the pressure would not clear the anomaly. Instead, it would cause a catastrophic thermal lock that could rupture the entire housing assembly. Moving with a calm, deliberate pace, Grant stepped into the control room and gently suggested to the lead technician that they should manually bleed the secondary nitrogen lines to equalize the internal thermal variance before adjusting the main pressure matrix. Harrison Vance, his face flushed with panic and corporate pride, immediately saw an opportunity to deflect blame from his own incompetence. He turned on Grant, raising his voice so that every technician in the room could hear, accusing the maintenance supervisor of stepping out of his lane, interfering with advanced engineering protocols, and attempting to sabotage a delicate government project with outdated, blue-collar guesswork. Within minutes, Victoria Langford arrived in the hangar, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. her presence immediately commanding the attention of the room, as she demanded to know why the critical simulation had been abruptly halted. Harrison Vance stepped forward smoothly, using his refined corporate vocabulary to construct a deceptive narrative, explaining to Victoria that the testing delay was entirely the fault of the maintenance department. He claimed that Grant Sullivan's team had improperly calibrated the manual overrides during their morning maintenance rounds, and that Grant had just entered the control room to actively disrupt the engineering staff's emergency correction procedures. Victoria, exhausted by weeks of sleepless nights and facing an aggressive deadline from the Pentagon, felt her patience completely snap as she looked at the situation through the lens of her intense corporate pressure. She looked at Grant, misinterpreting his absolute stillness and calm, unblinking eyes as a sign of arrogant disrespect and defiance toward her authority. She called for an immediate all-hands assembly right there on the hangar floor, bringing together hundreds of assembly workers, technicians, and senior executives to witness what she intended to use as an example of absolute accountability. In front of the entire assembly, Victoria delivered a blistering, cold reprimand, stating that Langford Dynamics had no room for low-skilled employees who refused to follow modern protocols and whose negligence threatened the livelihoods of every person in the company. She officially terminated Grant's employment on the spot, ordering him to pack his personal belongings and leave the corporate property immediately without a severance package. Grant stood perfectly silent throughout the entire public humiliation, never once raising his voice, never attempting to defend his honor, and never revealing his true identity to the woman who was wrongly destroying his livelihood. He knew that engaging in a public shouting match would only bring media scrutiny to his private life, potentially exposing his daughter Harper to the very corporate storm he had spent years trying to avoid. He simply nodded his head in a quiet, dignified acknowledgement, turned away from the crowded hangar, and began the long walk toward the locker room to retrieve his old steel toolbox and his daughter's cartoon lunchbox. If you have ever stood in a workplace where your dignity was completely stripped away by someone who chose to believe a polished lie over your proven honesty, please tell us your story in the comments below, because your experiences are the reason our family here stays so closely connected. This devastating moment highlights the deep division between blue-collar worker competence and the cold, unfeeling decisions of corporate executives who rely entirely on credentials and smooth talking, rather than real, hard-earned capability. Exactly 48 hours later, the echo of Grant's departing footsteps would return to haunt the executive suite in a way no one could have predicted. The executive office on the top floor of the Langford Dynamics Tower was silent, the expansive view of the city skyline offering no comfort to Victoria Langford as she sat alone behind her massive mahogany desk. The high-pressure simulation had not improved since Grant's forced exit. In fact, the entire Phoenix propulsion system had fallen into a complete digital lockdown, its core logic software refusing to accept any commands from Harrison Vance's elite engineering team. The multi-billion-dollar government audit was now less than 72 hours away, and Victoria felt a persistent, heavy knot of guilt and unease gnawing at her conscience whenever she recalled the absolute steady calm in Grant's eyes during his public dismissal. In a quiet, parallel corner of the building, a sharp young data analyst named Chloe, who had quietly respected the maintenance crew's meticulous attention to detail, was deep within the company's legacy digital archives attempting to trace the root origin of the engine's locked source code. To her absolute astonishment, Chloe discovered a series of deeply buried, heavily encrypted system logs dating back more than a decade, showing that the entire mathematical foundation of the Phoenix project had been authored by a single chief designer named Grant Sullivan, before his sudden disappearance from the corporate register. Realizing the horrifying magnitude of the mistake that had been made, Chloe bypassed the regular chain of command and ran directly to the executive suite, placing the ancient datasheets and original patent files directly onto Victoria's desk. As Victoria stared at the historical documents, seeing Grant's signature next to the very equations they were currently failing to understand, the cold realization of her own blind arrogance washed over her, making her realize she had publicly humiliated and fired the one man who actually built the company's future. Driven by a desperate need to save the looming defense contract and a profound sense of personal shame, Victoria obtained Grant's residential address from the old HR files and drove out to his modest suburban neighborhood late that evening. The contrast between her high-powered corporate world and Grant's reality was stark. There were no grand glass facades or manicured corporate lawns here. Just a small, weathered house with a simple tire swing hanging from an old oak tree in the front yard. When she stepped onto the porch and knocked on the door, she was met not by an angry, bitter former employee, but by Harper, Grant's sweet 8-year-old daughter, who politely welcomed the billionaire CEO inside with an innocent smile. As Victoria waited in the simple, neatly kept living room, Harper proudly showed her a collection of intricately repaired wooden toys and complex mechanical models scattered across the table, explaining that her father could fix absolutely anything in the world, and that he spent every single night helping her with her schoolwork and keeping her safe. Looking at the young girl's devotion and the humble, loving home Grant had built, the icy corporate walls around Victoria's heart began to completely melt, filling her with a deep, crushing regret for how casually she had dismissed a man's entire life and character based on a polished lie. When Grant finally entered the room, wearing a simple plaid shirt and carrying a load of fresh laundry, Victoria stood up and offered a breathless, desperate business apology, offering him a multi-million-dollar annual salary, a massive signing bonus, and an immediate vice presidency of engineering if he would return to the facility to unlock the system. Grant quietly set the laundry down, looked her directly in the eye with the same unshakable composure he had shown in the hangar, and calmly refused the immense wealth and the flashy corporate titles. He stated his real condition clearly, explaining that he did not care about her money or her executive positions. He would only return if the complete truth was documented, if his maintenance team's professional dignity was fully restored in writing, and if the company committed to a systemic overhaul that valued honest labor over corporate posturing. Before Victoria could even formulate a response to his dignified terms, her phone began vibrating violently in her hand with an automated emergency alert from the facility's primary security grid. Harrison Vance, in a final frantic attempt to force the propulsion system to initialize before the government officials arrived, had initiated an unauthorized manual thermal bypass, accidentally triggering a catastrophic thermal runaway state within the main high-pressure testing chamber. Less than 20 minutes remained before the entire history of Langford Dynamics would go up in smoke, forcing a confrontation that could no longer be hidden behind closed doors. The midnight air rushed past the windows of Victoria's vehicle as she and Grant sped back toward the industrial sector, the distant horizon already glowing with the flashing amber lights of emergency vehicles. When they sprinted through the heavy security doors of Hangar 4, the facility was in a state of absolute paralyzed chaos, with red warning strobe lights bathing the metallic walls in a frantic crimson glare and sirens wailing at a deafening pitch. The elite engineering staff stood frozen behind the safety glass of the observation deck, completely helpless as the digital telemetry monitors showed the cryogenic liquid nitrogen containment fields rapidly failing, threatening a massive pressure explosion that would level the entire testing wing. Harrison Vance was pacing frantically at the center of the control room, his expensive Italian suit soaked in sweat as he shouted a barrage of contradictory orders into a headset, completely unable to grasp the physical mechanics of the crisis he had created. Grant Sullivan stepped through the heavy blast doors, his quiet presence instantly projecting a natural, unshakable air of absolute authority that caused the panicked technicians to fall silent. Without a single second of hesitation, Grant completely bypassed the frantic executives and moved directly toward the primary manual control console, at the base of the main testing rig, completely ignoring the flashing alarms. He did not rely on the automated software models that had failed the younger technicians. Instead, he began executing a highly specific, complex sequence of manual mechanical overrides that only the original architect of the propulsion drive could possibly know. He reached into the valve housing, manually bleeding the overpressurized liquid nitrogen lines with deliberate, measured turns, his ears attuned to the specific pitch of the escaping gas as he carefully monitored the physical manifold pressure scales. With calm precision, he reached for the core keyboard and manually began typing long strings of raw mathematical constants into the system terminal, completely recalibrating the magnetic containment fields and rewriting the thrust vectoring algorithms using the original hexadecimal logic strings he had formulated in his private journals. A decade earlier, the young, credentialed newcomers and junior engineers stood back in absolute, stunned awe, watching a man they had long dismissed as a simple maintenance worker manipulate the multi-billion-dollar propulsion architecture with the effortless grace and mastery of a concert pianist. Harrison Vance, realizing his entire career and his years of stolen credit were being utterly dismantled in a matter of seconds, tried to step forward one last time, desperately hiding behind his corporate title and demanding that security immediately remove an unauthorized civilian from the high-security laboratory. But Victoria Langford stepped directly into his path, her voice ringing out clear and absolute over the sound of the blaring sirens as she ordered the security guards to stand down and commanded Harrison to step away from the controls permanently. As Grant input the final algorithmic correction, a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards, and the flashing red warning screens suddenly shifted back to a stable, glowing green, indicating that the thermal runaway had been successfully averted, and the core temperature was dropping safely back into nominal parameters. The undeniable truth of Grant's unparalleled genius was laid bare before every single witness in the room, leaving no doubt as to who truly held the capability to save the company's future. Harrison's face turned an ashen white as his composure completely unraveled under the weight of the mounting evidence and the cold, unyielding fury in Victoria's eyes, realizing that his long web of corporate deception had finally reached its absolute end. The central emotional tension between Victoria and Grant reached its peak as she looked at him with a mixture of profound gratitude and deep, lingering guilt for her past blindness. Yet Grant remained perfectly composed, simply reaching for a clean shop rag to wipe the black grease from his knuckles, his focus remaining entirely on ensuring the physical safety of the factory floor. One business day later, the arrival of a highly classified contingent would force Victoria to answer for her mistakes before the highest authorities in the land. The grand atrium of Langford Dynamics was filled to absolute capacity, with hundreds of employees, line technicians, assembly workers, and the entire board of directors gathered in a tense, expectant silence that made the vast room feel incredibly small. It was the exact moment of reckoning, the literal scene that had been set into motion when the high-ranking officials from the United States government's Advanced Aerospace Defense Program decided to conduct their final, unannounced audit. The 10 matte black government SUVs sat parked in a perfect, imposing line directly on the white marble steps outside, their engines idling with a low, powerful rumble that vibrated through the glass facade. Victoria Langford stood at the central microphone before the massive crowd, her fingers lightly gripping the edges of the podium as she chose to embrace absolute truth and human connection over her own corporate pride and the immediate convenience of an executive cover-up. At an immense short-term cost to her own professional reputation and her standing with the skeptical board of directors, she openly and clearly confessed her massive error to the entire assembled company. She publicly announced that she had wrongfully terminated the most brilliant engineering mind the organization had ever known, stripping away the corporate lies of the past decade and fully restoring Grant Sullivan's name, his historic patents, and his rightful legacy to the forefront of the global aerospace community. Harrison Vance had already been quietly escorted from the property by federal marshals to face a formal investigation into his corporate fraud, leaving a vacuum of power at the top of the engineering division that the board was desperate to fill. The lead government military official stepped forward, offering Grant a massive, showy promotion to Chief Technology Officer, complete with a global spotlight, a corner office, and an immense corporate expense account. Grant, true to his unshakable character and his deep dedication to his family, calmly and politely declined the flashy executive title and the public spotlight, asking instead for a systemic, quietly meaningful role as the Director of Experimental Safety and Research. This custom position allowed him to completely overhaul the workplace safety standards for the lower floor maintenance crews, while ensuring he could leave the facility exactly at 4 o'clock every single afternoon to remain a fully present, loving father for his daughter Harper. 6 months pass, and a quiet, warm Sunday afternoon settled over Grant's modest suburban home, the golden sunlight filtering softly through the leaves of the old oak tree in the front yard. There were no grand corporate banners or flashing media cameras here, just the peaceful sound of wind chimes and distant laughter echoing from the porch steps. Victoria Langford was there, having shed her sharp, restrictive corporate suits for a simple, comfortable knit sweater, her face relaxed and completely free from the suffocating weight of the billionaire boardroom. She was sitting directly on the wooden deck, her hands covered in light glue as she patiently helped young Harper construct a small model rocket out of balsa wood and paper, her laughter genuine and easy as the young girl proudly explained her own ideas for the rocket's wing design. A small, profound physical detail symbolized the massive transformation that had occurred over the past year. Grant's old, worn steel toolbox now sat polished and clean on a prominent display shelf inside the home's entryway, placed right next to a beautifully framed photograph of his late wife, representing a past that was no longer hidden in grief, but fully honored in peace. Grant stepped out onto the porch, carrying a simple tray of fresh lemonade, watching the quiet interaction between his daughter and the woman who had once wrongly dismissed him, his face content in the knowledge that his dignity had been fully restored without ever sacrificing his commitment to his child. Victoria looked up at him, a warm, soft expression in her eyes, and they shared a quiet, meaningful exchange about how true worth is never measured by the height of a glass corporate tower or the dollar value of a government contract, but by the peace, honesty, and deep love we create for the people we cherish most. It is a profound truth that the modern world often overlooks the quietest souls among us, completely writing off the steady, hardworking individuals who keep the gears of our lives turning without ever asking for a spotlight or a round of applause. We live in a society that frequently rewards the loudest voices, the most polished presentations, and the grand corporate titles, while completely ignoring the incredible depth, genius, and dedication found in those who choose to serve from the background. But as we have seen through Grant's journey, true capability and character cannot be hidden forever behind a humble uniform or a low-status job description. And real strength lies in the silent endurance of a parent who puts their family's peace above personal pride. Has someone in your own life ever been misjudged the way Grant was? Written off as ordinary or unimportant before anyone bothered to take the time to see the extraordinary genius, honesty, or depth they possessed? Tell us about them in the comments below, even if it is just to finally give them the recognition and credit they always truly deserved. If you believe that quiet, overlooked people deserve to be seen, celebrated, and protected in a world that often forgets their value, please consider subscribing to our channel and becoming a permanent part of our family here, where we promise to never let true worth go unnoticed. And stay tuned for the final truth.